The Gulen movement has left a major mark on the Turkish politics for over a decade. They infiltrated into government positions and managed to become a major power broker in Turkey. With their financial and political support, Erdogan not only managed to remain in power, but also managed to purge the Kemalist structures in the army and the bureaucracy. But what is the Gulen movement? Gulen movement is a religious organization founded by nowadays US-based cleric Fetullah Gulen. When it comes to religious groups in Turkey, I would put the Gulen movement on the more moderate side. However, they are by no means secular, especially not in Western standards. But they always try to look more moderate to the outside as a cunning political move. Fetullah Gulen was originally a part of the Nur group, pioneered by the Kurdish scholar Said Nursi. However, in the 70s and the 80s, he started breaking away from the rest of the Nur movement and started developing his own organization. He operated in Izmir as a preacher until the 90s and gained many followers over the years with his oratory skills. Gülen's ultimate goal was to get rid of the dictatorial secular regime in Turkey. Gulen movement was not alone in this. Turkey was always filled with Islamist movements. What was striking about the Gulen movement was their way of conduct. Other Islamist movements openly declared their mission wherever they could, avoided state institutions like plague, and attempted to achieve their goals by attacking these institutions from the outside. This resulted in hostile backlash from the public, and they were easily suppressed by the government. Gulen movement, in contrast, never declared its intentions openly. They always kept their distance from Erdogan and his Islamist parties. Fetullah Gulen openly supported the military interventions of 1970, 1980, and even 28 February. While hijabi women were getting kicked out of universities, Fetullah Gulen was praising the military for upholding the democratic institutions, meanwhile advising his female followers to go to the schools without wearing hijab. Of course, this was all a farce, and the military knew it as well. Gulen was arrested by the military in 1980 and forced to flee to the US in 1999 by these military governments he praised. As opposed to some other religious leaders in Turkey that wore traditional clothes and grew beards, Gulen looked relatively modern and way less threatening. Gulen also had a sound strategy. His vision was to raise what he called the golden generation. This generation of followers would be educated and do anything to get into influential government positions. The Turkish secular regime could not be overthrown from the outside, but from within. Gulen wanted his followers to become police officers, soldiers, lawyers, prosecutors, and teachers. But to achieve this, Gulen first needed to establish the required infrastructure. The first move was made in 1980s, during Prime Minister Turgut Özal's term. Özal allowed religious organizations to open schools. Gulen movement took advantage of this swiftly. In 1982, the Gülenists opened the Yamanlar School, alongside thousands of scram schools all across Turkey. Naturally, these schools were not mostly directed towards those that lived in the cities, with access to government services and quality education, as people with opportunities were harder to recruit. Gulen movement instead targeted the poor, rural population in the Anatolian countryside. State-funded education was almost non-existent in these areas, especially back then. University education was hard to access, and there weren't any resources to prepare these poor students for university exams. Funded by donations, Gulen schools provided cheap and affordable education. The Gulen movement was offering a bright future to these poor kids in remote villages. And what was their allegiance in return? Gulen had done what the state could not do, and these people would not forget this. This education project was boosted by yet another project. Gulen movement quickly opened thousands of houses all across the country. These houses were financially supported with donations and were invaluable to students who needed to find housing. Once again, all these students were from poor rural families and had to move to larger cities to get access to a higher university education. Gulen movement was thus providing an essential service. Fetullah Gulen called these the houses of light. In these houses, students prayed together and attended weekly lectures on not only religion but also on Gulen's teachings. They had yearly reading camps where they read Gulen's books. By providing housing, the movement was also gaining tremendous power over the lives of these students. A student that lived in organization's house could not have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They had to volunteer with organization's charity work and events. Every student was also responsible for mentoring several younger students. A high school student mentored middle school students. A university student mentored high school students. These mentorship ties were used to raise and recruit the next generation. And most importantly, their futures were determined by their leaders in the movement. They made marital matches between students. Such a marriage ensured that like-minded followers married each other and strengthened each other's loyalty to the movement and Gulen. Whatever the organization needed at the time, the students were pushed to pursue a career in that field. For example, in the 80s, Gulen movement needed teachers for their schools. Thousands of teachers were needed, so the university students were told to become teachers. In the 90s, this focus slowly started shifting. The movement started phase 2 of its plan. Students were now being told to pursue careers with more political power. Gulenist students became police officers, lawyers, prosecutors, and judges. Of course, they would also love to become military officers, but by early 2000s, the military still strongly opposed them and prevented Gulenists from establishing themselves within the armed forces. This expansion was by no means friendly. Gulenists were like a nationwide networking group with millions of members. As soon as a Gulenist obtained a key position, he or she would help out other Gulenist students to obtain positions within said organization. Gulenist directors in police academies admitted other Gulenist students and actively helped them to succeed. Gulenist judges and government officials hired other Gulenists. It was to such a degree that during 2000s, Gulenists stole and distributed government examination questions to their followers to ensure their success. By virtue of these aggressive expansion strategies, from 90s on, Gulenists controlled a good portion of the police force and wielded significant influence over the courts. Their organization was also something to behold. Gulenists were organized like a military force, and they were extremely hierarchical. The smallest part of the organization was their so-called houses of light. Every house contained 3 to 10 students. At the head of these students, there was the house leader, the so-called elder brother. These houses were organized in regions. Every region had a leader, called the regionist. Above them, there was the city imams. As their power and size grew, they became more organized into more specific divisions. They had school leaders that looked after employees in schools. They had Air Force leaders that led members within the Air Force, and prosecutor leaders. As the movement expanded overseas, they also started creating positions like the Imam of Afghanistan or the Imam of Senegal, etc., that oversaw the operations in these countries. They basically had a state within a state. A Gulenist officer may have had a legal superior within the police organization, but when it came to shove, he or she would take orders from his leader within the Gulen movement, not from his superior in the police organization. In the 90s, Gulen movement expanded their operations worldwide. Gulenists opened over 700 schools across the globe and established their divisions in Africa, Central Asia, the Balkans, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The reason behind this geographical decision was that these countries were poor and their peoples were easier to impress and recruit to the organization. The main goal of this international presence was to convert the locals to Islam first and then spread the influence of the Gulen movement. The children of government officials in these countries were specifically enrolled, as well as some bright students who would not be able to gain access to a proper education without the Gulenist schools. The Gulenists especially saw a major opportunity in Central Asia as the Soviets collapsed, which created an ideological vacuum. I believe here is how the American Gulenist partnership developed. Gulenists were Sunni and thus they were naturally anti-Iran, which was and still a great enemy to the US. In the 90s, both the Gulenists and the Americans were worried that the ideological vacuum in Central Asia would be filled by Iran or otherwise extremist groups. This made the US and Gulen natural allies, not only in Turkey, but across the globe. Gulen and his non-violent and more moderate Islamism would be key to securing American interests in the Islamic world and preventing the spread of jihadism and Iranian influences. Although it is hard to gauge due to the opacity of the Gulen movement, it appears that it was directly funded by the US government. A CBS report in 2018 calculated that the movement received $2 billion from Washington for its operations in North America alone. The organization was welcomed in pro-Western and pro-US countries. Meanwhile, it was met with hostility in countries with hostile governments to the US. Russia, Uzbekistan, and Iran shut down all operations of the Gulen movement in early 2000s. Russia also made sure to deport all Gulenists from Crimea after the annexation in 2014. Such an organization also needed a financial structure to function. Throughout the 80s, the organization had funded its operations with donations from small business owners and various other members. These donations continued, but on top of them, the organization also started expanding its corporate division. This division was composed of three different groups. On one hand, there were corporations owned by members of the organization, such as the billion-dollar Koza İpek Holding and Boydak Holding. These corporations donated heavily to the movement and were indirectly controlled by Gulen. The second branch was made of companies directly owned by the Gulen movement. These were companies such as Bank Asya or Kaynak Holding. These were classified as anonymous corporations and had extremely opaque ownership structures. They were ruled by boards of directors appointed by the Gulen movement. And the last component of this financial organization were the outside partners. As Gulen movement's power grew, more and more companies that did not have ties to the movement started aligning themselves with the Gulenists. The Gulenist companies had created a closed business environment by mainly doing business with each other. For example, Bank Asya would give loans to Gulenist-owned Kaynak Holdings, which would sell its books to Gulenist schools, which then organized school trips with Gulenist tourism company Nuance Tour. Thus, other corporations aligned themselves with the Gulenists to break into this lucrative circle. By 2010s, the Gulen movement was starkly similar to 19th century Japanese Zaibatsu companies. It was an alliance of corporations led by Fetullah Gulen, and the entire lives of these employees were shaped by these companies and ultimately Gulen. The newspaper they read, the marriages they made, and their bank accounts were all decided by the Gulen organization. In 2017, the size of Gulenist corporations was estimated at $20 billion, and this was after a 4-year-long war with the government, which had crippled the Gulen movement financially. So, at its peak, the organization's net worth was likely much more. My educated guess would be that the organization was at least 3 to 4 times richer at its peak in 2012, before the war against Erdogan. Based on that estimation, the movement controlled almost 10% of the Turkish GDP, which is massive. During Erdogan's first term, the government actively supported the Gulenists. Erdogan needed allies to start his war against the Kemalists, and Gulenists were an invaluable ally. Gulenists took over the police and started slowly taking over the courts. As I said, however, by 2007, the military still was largely untouched by the Gulenists, as the military paid extra attention to their infiltration attempts. In response, the budget of the Turkish police force was increased significantly over this period. Both the Gulenists and Erdogan wanted to create an alternative fighting force to the secular army. If push came to shove, they needed their own armed forces. The number of police officers increased from 170,000 in 2003 to 370,000. The government also passed a law allowing the police force to acquire heavy weaponry. Turkish police started demilitarizing by adding artillery pieces, MRAPs, armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and even attack helicopters to its inventory. This acquisition was justified as a move to counter Kurdish insurgencies in southeastern provinces. Gulenists had also expanded the intelligence units within the police and constantly monitored their enemies and allies alike. This would come extremely handy in their future wars with both the Kemalists and Erdogan. By 2007, where my last episode ended in, Gulen organization was extremely powerful. It controlled the ever-growing police force and key positions in the justice system, and it had seemingly infinite financial resources. The movement owned the largest TV channels and newspapers to control the public opinion, and owned thousands of schools to shape the minds of the young people who were ready to replace the old Kemalists within the government. After the 2007 elections, both Erdogan and the Gulen movement were ready to start their offensive against the secular Kemalists. And this would change Turkey forever. Thank you for watching. If you have come this far, please leave a like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one, and peace be upon you.